The morning Caleb Holt married Nora Finch, the sky over Dust Creek was the color of an old bruise. Purple and yellow and wrong in a way that made the preacher rush through his words like he was afraid the clouds might open up before he finished. Most folks standing outside the church that day weren't there to wish the couple well. They were there to watch, to see if it was really true that Caleb Holt, the most sought-after rancher between the Colorado River and the New Mexico border, was really going to tie himself to the Finch woman. Nora stood beside him in a dress that was clean but not new, her hands folded in front of her like she was waiting for something to go wrong. She didn't look nervous the way a bride was supposed to look. She looked steady, quiet the way a well is quiet, deep and still and cold if you weren't careful about how you leaned in. Her hair was the color of dry grass in late summer, and her eyes were a gray that people in Dust Creek said made them uncomfortable, though none of them could explain exactly why. Caleb didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Nora, and whatever he saw in her face settled something in him that had been restless for years. He said his vows in a low, clear voice, and when she said hers, it was in the same tone. Not warm, not cold, just honest, the way you'd speak to someone you intended to deal with fairly. The town had already made up its mind about her before the ink was dry on the county records that listed her as Nora Holt. She had come to Dust Creek 8 months earlier on a stage from somewhere nobody could pin down exactly. She'd answered an advertisement placed by old Gus Finch, who needed someone to keep house and manage his small spread since his wife passed and his joints had gone bad. What nobody expected was that she'd spend more time in the barn than the kitchen. What nobody expected was that Gus, cantankerous and bitter as river bark, would take to her like she was the daughter he'd never had. And what certainly nobody expected was that when Gus died of a heart that just gave out one February morning, he'd leave everything he owned to Nora. That was when Dust Creek decided it didn't like her. They couldn't say she'd done anything wrong exactly. She'd cared for that old man through the cold months, brought him his medicine, read to him from the Bible even though she wasn't a particularly religious woman herself, and kept his small herd fed and watered through weather that had driven harder people to give up and go east. But the town had its theories. Women like her didn't just appear from nowhere. Women who knew how to handle a rope and read cattle the way most people read faces. There was something unnatural about that. Something that made people nervous in the way unexplained things always make people nervous. Caleb had met her at the feed store. He hadn't been looking for a wife. He'd been looking for someone who could tell him what was wrong with one of his bulls that had been off its feed for 2 weeks. Because his regular hand had quit and his neighbor, old Pete Deering, was down with a fever. Nora had been standing at the counter ordering supplies when she overheard him describing the symptoms to the store owner, who knew about as much about cattle medicine as he knew about flying. She turned around and told Caleb, without any preamble or apology for interrupting, that it sounded like the bull had gotten into some loco weed and that he needed to pull it from the pasture immediately and give it plenty of clean water and hay and keep it away from the others for at least 2 weeks. He'd looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You sure about that?" She said, "No, but I'm more sure than anyone else you've talked to today." He'd gone back to the ranch, done exactly what she said, and the bull recovered inside of 10 days. He went back to the feed store the following week and asked if she'd be willing to come look at his herd. She came. She walked through his pasture in those worn boots of hers, checking flanks and eyes and hooves with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing it since before she could read. She told him 3 of his cows were underfed. 1 had an infected hoof that needed treatment, and he needed to move his whole herd to the south pasture because the grass where they were grazing was going to give out by summer. She was right about all of it. He asked her to come back. She did. Then he started finding reasons to be at the ranch when she came, and then finding reasons to extend the conversations, and then one evening in April when the light was coming through the barn door in long golden slabs and she was checking a calf that had been slow to gain weight, he just watched her and knew. Not the way boys know when they see a pretty face. The way a man knows when he sees something true. He asked her to marry him in the most direct, unromantic way possible. He said he was 34 years old, had 400 acres, a solid house, a working well, a good herd, and no debt. He said he wasn't a man given to flattery or grand gestures. But he was reliable and he wasn't cruel and he thought she was the most capable person he'd ever met in his life. He said he'd be grateful if she'd consider it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she'd think about it. She came back 3 days later and said yes, but she had conditions. She wanted to keep managing the cattle herself. She wanted her own money for her own work. She wanted nobody telling her what she could and couldn't do on that ranch. He agreed to all of it without negotiating. She nodded and said that was fine then. That was the whole courtship. Now they were married, and Dust Creek was watching, and Nora moved through the small reception at the church hall with the same unhurried calm she moved through everything. She ate a little, spoke when spoken to, and watched the room with those gray eyes that took everything in and gave nothing back. Several women tried to be kind. Several others didn't try very hard. A man named Rudd Calloway, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county and who had wanted to buy Gus's land before Nora inherited it, made a point of stopping by to congratulate Caleb in a voice that made it clear he found the whole arrangement mildly amusing. Rudd was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with a red face and pale eyes that were always measuring something. He'd made his fortune young and spent the years since adding to it, and he didn't hide the fact that he believed Dust Creek ran on his goodwill. "Quite a woman you've picked, Holt," he said, with a smile that showed most of his teeth. Caleb said, "I think so." Rudd looked at Nora. "You planning on keeping that little Finch place too? Or folding it into Caleb's operation?" Nora said, "I haven't decided yet." Something moved through Rudd's pale eyes. Not anger exactly. Something that was planning itself. He smiled wider and said it was a pleasure and moved on, and Nora watched him go with an expression that Caleb, who was already learning to read her, understood meant she was filing something away. The first weeks of their marriage were polite and careful. They were two people who didn't know each other well, living under the same roof, doing the work of a ranch that needed doing. Caleb was up before dawn and working until dark, and so was Nora. She took over the management of the herd completely, and what she did with those cattle was something his older hands, men who'd been working with livestock since before Nora was born, watched with a mix of grudging respect and bafflement. She knew things. Not book things, bone-deep things. She could tell when a cow was going to calf 2 days before it happened. She could walk through the herd in the early morning and come back with a list of which animals were showing early signs of illness, what they needed, and in what order. She moved among them without fear, and they came to her without skittishness, which was unusual enough that one of Caleb's older hands, a weathered man named Jesse who had been working cattle for 30 years, stood watching her one morning with his hat in his hands and then said to Caleb very quietly, "Where'd she learn all that?" Caleb said he didn't know. Jesse said, "Well, whatever she learned it from, this herd hasn't looked this good in 3 years." That was high praise from Jesse, who had never in Caleb's memory voluntarily complimented anything. The trouble started, as trouble usually does, when things were going well enough that someone else decided they wanted what you had. Rudd Calloway had been watching the Holt operation. He had spies the way some men have friends, naturally without effort because people told him things in exchange for his goodwill, and his goodwill was worth something in Dust Creek. What he heard was that Caleb's herd was growing, that the quality of the stock was improving, and that the woman running things had a gift that was turning a solid ranch into something genuinely impressive. That bothered Rudd in the specific way that other people's success bothered him, not because he needed what they had, but because he believed anything worth having in Dust Creek ought to belong to him. He started with the water. There was a creek that ran along the northern edge of Caleb's property. It had always been shared usage. Caleb's herd drank from it, and so did the small spread to the north that Rudd had bought 2 years back. In July, Rudd's men built a dam. It wasn't a large dam, and it didn't completely cut off Caleb's access, but it reduced the flow enough during the dry weeks that Caleb's herd was struggling. Nora found the dam on a Tuesday morning when she went to check why the cattle on the north pasture seemed restless. She came back to the house and told Caleb what she'd found. She was not shouting. She was never a woman who shouted. But there was something in her voice that was the verbal equivalent of a door being closed very firmly. Caleb rode out to see it himself. Then he rode to town and spoke to the county land office. The man at the land office told him it was a complicated situation, water rights being what they were, and that it would take some time to sort out. Caleb understood, without being told plainly, that Rudd had already spoken to the man at the land office. He came home and told Nora. She listened. Then she said, We'll manage. He looked at her. How? She said. I've been thinking about moving the south herd anyway. The grass is better down by the Miller Creek branch. If we rotate them properly, we can get through the dry season without the North Creek. It wasn't a perfect solution. It was more work and more moving and more careful management than they'd planned for. But Nora made it work. She restructured the grazing rotation so efficiently that by August, despite the reduced water access, the herd was in better condition than the same time the previous year. Rudd tried something else in September. A man came to town, a buyer from back east, well-dressed and confident, with a letter of introduction and an interest in purchasing cattle. He met with Rudd first, which was natural since Rudd's operation was the largest. But then he asked around about other operations in the county, and people told him about Caleb Holt's improving herd. He rode out to the ranch and spoke with Nora, since Caleb was in the far pasture. He was polite and professional and made a fair offer for 20 head. Nora told him she'd speak with her husband. That evening, a man she didn't recognize came to the property and told the buyer, who was staying at the Dust Creek Inn, that the Holt cattle had been showing signs of a sickness that the family was keeping quiet about. The buyer left town the next morning without completing any purchase. Nora found out about this through Jesse, who had heard it from the blacksmith, who had heard it from the innkeeper. She sat with the information for 2 days. Then she went to see the buyer herself, catching him at the stage depot just before he left. She spoke with him for 20 minutes. She described her herd, its history, its current condition. She offered to let him come back and inspect every animal himself before any money changed hands. She told him, plainly and without drama, that someone had deliberately fed him false information and she believed she knew who, though she couldn't prove it. The buyer looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had been in the cattle business for 15 years and had been lied to by experts. He came back to the ranch. He spent a full day with the herd. He bought 30 head, 10 more than he'd originally intended, at a price that was more than fair. When Rudd heard about it, his pale eyes went very still. He began to understand that the woman was a different kind of problem than he'd anticipated. Winter came early that year and it came hard. The temperature dropped in November and kept dropping, and by December there was snow on the ground that didn't melt, which was unusual enough in that part of the territory that even the old-timers were uneasy. Caleb and Nora worked through it together, hauling feed, breaking ice in the water troughs, checking on the weaker animals, moving the most vulnerable cows into the barn at night. It was during these weeks that they stopped being polite strangers in the same house and became something else. Not tender, exactly, neither of them was built for tenderness in the obvious sense. But there was a new ease between them, a shorthand that developed from spending long hard hours doing difficult work side by side. One night in January, when they came in from the barn after midnight and Nora was washing her hands at the basin and Caleb was standing at the window watching the snow come down again, he said, without quite meaning to, "I never thanked you properly. For the bull. That first time." She looked up. "I didn't do anything that first time. I just told you what it probably was. You were right. I'm usually right about cattle." She dried her hands. "I'm not always right about other things." He looked at her then. "What other things?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "People. I tend to trust the wrong ones too long and distrust the right ones too quickly." He thought about that. "Which was I?" "The second one," she said. "I distrusted you longer than I should have." He didn't say anything to that, and she didn't say anything more, and they went to bed separately the way they always had. But something had shifted, the way ground shifts when water finally finds its way through stone. The real trouble, the kind that couldn't be navigated around or outworked, arrived in February on the back of a man named Cole Akers, who rode into Dust Creek claiming to be a land assessor from the territorial government. He had papers that looked right, a manner that was professional, and a story that was clean and consistent. He said there had been a question raised about the original deed on the Finch property, now part of the Holt Holdings through Nora's inheritance, and that the territorial office needed to review the documentation. Nora handed over her copies of Gus Finch's deed, the will, the probate records. Everything was in order. Akers looked at it all carefully, nodded, and said it would need to be reviewed by the territorial office and that in the meantime she shouldn't make any major changes to the property. Jesse, who had lived in Dust Creek for 40 years and knew every face that had ever passed through it, told Caleb that evening that he had never seen Cole Acres before in his life, which shouldn't have been possible for a man who claimed to have been working this territory for 10 years. Caleb went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to the Territorial Land Office in the capital. The reply came 2 days later. There was no Cole Acres on the staff of the Territorial Land Office. There had been no inquiry raised about the Finchholt property. By the time they went looking for Acres, he was gone, and so were Nora's original deed documents. She was calm when Caleb told her. Scary calm, the kind that had nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with a person deciding what to do next. She said she needed to think. She went out to the barn. He let her go. She came back an hour later and said, Gus kept a copy of everything in a tin box buried under the floor of the old feed shed. He told me once, just once, that he didn't trust banks or lawyers or fire, and so he kept copies of everything important somewhere none of them could reach it. She went to the old Finch property herself, dug up the tin box, and found the copies. They were older, handwritten in Gus's cramped script, but they were legitimate and they were legal and they were, crucially, dated and witnessed by 2 men whose names appeared in the county records. They brought the copies to the county clerk and had them officially registered and certified. Whatever Rudd had planned, and it was clearly Rudd, even if Cole Acres would never be proven to be his man, it had not worked. Rudd made one more move in March. He called a meeting of the cattle association that operated loosely in the county, and at that meeting he proposed a set of grazing regulations that, if adopted, would have effectively prevented any operation smaller than his from using the shared county land that smaller ranchers depended on. He framed it as a quality control measure. He had 4 other ranchers ready to vote with him, men who owed him money or favors or both. Nora went to the meeting. Caleb went with her. She had spent 2 weeks visiting every small rancher in the county before the meeting, not to lobby them exactly, but to explain, plainly and without exaggeration, what the proposed regulations would actually mean for their operations. She brought numbers. She brought comparisons from other counties where similar regulations had been adopted. She was not a woman who raised her voice in public, but she spoke clearly and she spoke long enough to make sure every person in that room understood exactly what they were voting on. When the vote came, Rudd had 4 men on his side. Nora had 9. He looked at her across that meeting room and his face was flat and unreadable, and she looked back at him the same way, and everyone in the room felt, without quite being able to say what it was, that something had been decided. It was spring again by the time Dust Creek began, slowly and without announcing it, to revise its opinion of Nora Holt. It wasn't a grand reversal. Small towns don't make grand reversals. What happened was more like the way ice melts, gradual, almost imperceptible, and then suddenly you look and the ice is gone and you can't quite remember when it happened. The women who had been coolest to her started accepting her at the store with something closer to neutrality. The men who had been amused by her started asking her questions about their own cattle when they ran into her in town. Questions they tried to make casual but which she answered seriously and without rubbing their faces in it. Jesse, who was not an easy man to impress and who expressed approval of anything about as naturally as a rock expressed opinions, told Caleb one afternoon that Nora was the best cattlewoman he'd ever worked for, and he had worked for 7. Caleb said he knew. Jesse said he was just making sure Caleb knew. There was a morning in April, almost exactly a year after Caleb had first asked Nora to consider marrying him, when they were both up before dawn, moving through the barn in the dark the way they had learned to move, quietly, efficiently, without getting in each other's way. The pregnant cows were close to calving, and they'd been checking every few hours. Nora was crouched beside a black cow with a blaze on her face, speaking to her in a low voice, and Caleb was watching from across the barn, and something in his chest felt full in a way that he didn't have a word for, so he didn't try to find one. Nora looked up and found him watching. She didn't look away. She said, "She's close. Maybe tonight." He came over and crouched beside her. The cow was calm, her eyes soft. He put his hand on her flank and felt the slow, strong movement of life underneath. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I asked you to marry me, I told you it was practical, that I needed someone capable. And it was true. But it wasn't the whole truth." She was quiet. I asked you because I thought you were the most remarkable person I'd ever met, and I was afraid if I told you that, you'd say no. Because you don't?" He paused, trying to find it. "You don't put much stock in sentiment, and I thought if I made it practical, you'd at least consider it." She looked at the cow for a moment. Then she said, "I knew that." He looked at her. "What?" "I knew that wasn't the whole reason." She looked at him then, those gray eyes straight and clear in the lamplight. "I said yes anyway." He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be less than what he meant. She turned back to the cow and put her hand beside his on the warm flank. Outside, the darkness was beginning to soften at its edges, the slow arrival of morning coming across the flat land the way it always did. Not suddenly, but inevitably, as though it had always been on its way. The calf came just after dawn. It was a strong one, dark like its mother, up on its legs within the hour, nudging at her side with the insistent urgency of new life. Nora watched it with her arms crossed and a look on her face that wasn't quite a smile but was close enough that Caleb, who had been studying her expressions for a year now, recognized it as one. Jesse came in to check on things and looked at the calf and said, "Good strong legs. She's going to be something in a couple years." Nora said, "Yes." Jesse looked at the two of them. Then he put his hat back on and went out without another word, which was as close to giving them privacy as Jesse was capable of. The summer that followed was the best the Holt Ranch had seen in a decade. The herd grew and the quality of the stock drew buyers from 3 counties over. Rudd Calloway, for his part, pulled back. Not graciously, men like Rudd didn't do gracious retreat, but he found other directions to point his ambitions, other properties to acquire, and the Holt operation dropped off his list of things to interfere with. Whether that was because he'd decided it wasn't worth the effort, or because he'd learned enough about Nora Holt to know that she was not a problem that would stay solved, Caleb didn't know. He asked Nora once what she thought. She considered it and said, "He's not finished. He's just waiting. Men like that are always waiting." Then she said, "But we'll be ready," and went back to what she'd been doing. That was enough. In town, the whispers didn't stop entirely. Small towns never fully stop whispering, but they changed in character. Now, when people talked about the Holt woman, there was something different underneath the words. Something that was almost admiration trying on the costume of reservation. A woman who could handle a ranch like that, who could face down a man like Rudd Calloway without raising her voice, who could walk into a room full of men and change a vote without threatening anyone. That was not a woman you could dismiss easily, even if you wanted to. Some of the younger women in Dust Creek started coming to Nora with questions. Not about cattle at first, about other things. About property and rights and what you could do when someone was trying to take something that belonged to you. She answered their questions the same way she answered questions about cattle. Directly, practically, without softening the hard parts. A few of them started coming out to the ranch on occasion, and Nora let them, and slowly something began that wasn't quite a friendship in the conventional sense but was real nonetheless. There was a girl named Ada, 17 years old, the daughter of a struggling farmer on the west side of the county. She started coming by in the late afternoons in August, ostensibly to help with the calves, but mostly to watch Nora work and ask questions. Nora answered the questions and put her to work doing real things, not make work, and Ada turned out to have the same instinct with the animals that Nora had recognized in herself at that age. One afternoon when they were working side by side and Ada said, hesitant, that her father wanted her to take a position in town as a seamstress because there was no future in farming for a girl, Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want?" Ada said she wanted to work with cattle. She said it quietly, like she expected to be corrected. Nora said, "Then learn everything you can and don't let anyone tell you that you can't." Ada looked at her. "Is it that simple?" Nora said, "No, it's that complicated. But it starts there." Ada came back. She kept coming back all through the fall, and Nora kept teaching her. And by November the girl could read a cow's condition as well as most grown men who'd been doing it for years. The night of the first hard frost, Caleb and Nora sat on the porch in the dark because neither of them could sleep and neither of them felt the need to pretend otherwise. The sky was enormous and clear, and the stars were extraordinary in the way they only are when the air is cold and dry and the land is silent. Their breath made small clouds that dissolved upward into nothing. After a long time Nora said, "I never told you where I came from." He said, "You don't have to." "I know." She was quiet again. "I had a husband before. In New Mexico. He was not a good man." She said it flatly, the way you state a fact that is no longer contested. "I left. I came a long way to be somewhere he wouldn't follow, and then I found Gus, and then I found this." He sat with that. Then he said, "Does he know where you are?" "No. I've been careful." She paused. "But it's why I was slow to trust you. It wasn't personal." He said, "I figured it was something like that." She looked at him. "You figured. You don't take up a lot of space unless you're working. And the way you watch doors." He stopped. "I noticed." She looked back at the sky. "You notice more than you let on. So do you." She almost smiled. "Maybe that's why it works." He thought about that. He thought about the year that had passed, the work and the cold mornings and the fights they'd navigated and the small careful way trust had built itself between them. Slowly, the way good things build. Not in a moment, but in the accumulation of moments, each one too small to name but adding up to something you couldn't mistake. He said, "You're safe here. I want you to know that." She didn't say anything for a moment. When she did, her voice was even. "I know." Then, quieter, "I know." The frost settled over the land and the cattle stood in the fields like dark shadows and the stars burned cold and brilliant overhead. And the two of them sat together in the particular silence of people who have nothing left to prove to each other and nowhere else they'd rather be. Come spring, Dust Creek would have new things to talk about. Rudd Calloway would make his next move, whatever it was. Ada's father would either come around or he wouldn't. The herd would grow or it would struggle. The water would run or it wouldn't. None of it was certain. But there was a black cow in the barn with a strong-legged daughter at her side. And there were two people on a porch who had found, through practicality and stubbornness and an unwillingness to settle for less than honest, something that most people spend their whole lives looking for and never quite reach. And the land stretched out before them, wide and unforgiving and absolutely beautiful, the same as it had always been, the same as it would always be, patient as stone and older than any of their troubles, waiting with perfect indifference for them to make of it what they could.